Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Today, my guest is probably the most famous investigative journalist in the world. I'm joined today by Mr. Gerald Posner, who's the author of this fantastic, outstanding book called Why America Slept, The Failure to Prevent 9/11, which is, of course, about intelligence failures that led the terrorists to do what they did on 9/11, 2001. And together with Gerald today, we'll talk about the Saudi involvement, their foreknowledge, and everything that is behind the Saudi connection to 9/11. Thanks for your time, Gerald. Thanks for joining me today.
Leonardo, great to be with you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, as I said, you're probably the most famous investigative journalist in the world because you've been covering cases such as the murder of President Kennedy, the murder of Martin Luther King, the death of Princess Diana. So would you like to tell us something about yourself, like to introduce yourself and give us some background before we start?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very kindly for the very kind introduction. I don't know, I'm sure there are plenty of investigative journalists who will say, oh, no, he's nothing compared to what I do. But I try my best to tackle controversial subjects and to see if, without knowing what my conclusion will be. So, I'm sort of old-fashioned. I used to be a lawyer in another life, but since I've been writing books, 13 books over nearly 40 years, I approach a subject that there's some controversy on. People are debating whether it's a conspiracy, not a conspiracy, who's involved, what's happened. And then I dive into it and I see what I find in terms of credible evidence. I come to my conclusions and I publish them. And, I take the accolades and congratulations if people think it's good, and I take the criticism if they think it's not. I have written about the Kennedy assassination. I did write about Martin Luther King. But I wrote about those as historical matters because they happened when I was young. I was in fourth grade when Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King, I was 14 at the time. With this book on 9/11, it happened the same way if a journalist was alive and 35 or 40 years old when Kennedy was killed, an investigative journalist, and said a year later, I'm going to look into the assassination and find out what happened. You're finding out about what happened in a contemporary case that meant something to you. I lived in New York with my wife, Tricia, at the time of 9/11, and we were very affected by it, as everyone was. And we were actually donating our time down near Ground Zero, near the World Trade Centers. There wasn't much to do, but you were a volunteer and you were helping to pass along food and make things available to the first responders. And one time, resting at night, we were sitting next to somebody else who was a volunteer there, and we said, what are you doing? She was a student at NYU. And she said to the two of us, what do you do? And we said, we're journalists. And she said, well, what are you doing here? Why aren't you out finding out what happened? And I thought to myself, my God, she's right. It was like a light bulb went off. And so that started the process. So this book started without ever thinking of it as a book and then became one. And because I did it in that first 2 years after 9/11, it's what I call the first draft of history. As you know, there have been other books, The Looming Towers by Lawrence Wright and others, some great books about 9/11. When you're investigating and reporting on it in the immediate aftermath, you're doing the deep dive into that area where you don't have the perspective yet for history, but you're looking for new information to disclose.
Well, so let's get to the heart of the matter. The whole Saudi connection stuff, as far as you report, starting from what Abu Zubaydah, who's one of the al-Qaeda leaders, said to his interrogators when he was interrogated in Afghanistan, because he said that two of the, well, maybe more than two, but whatever, the Saudi royals had foreknowledge of the attacks and that they were actually shielding bin Laden. The first thing I would like to ask you is, how can we be sure that what Abu Zubaydah said is trustworthy?
Well, you asked the key question. So, and we can't, because we can't ask the person who knows the answer, Zubaydah himself. He's still in Guantanamo. We could ask him if the U.S. would allow us to ask him. I've tried to get access to him multiple times. He's harder to talk to than the Pope is. So, it's impossible to get to Zubaydah. And we might have been able to find out what I reported in the book and the accuracy of it and what he said to the American investigators who were pretending to be Saudis if we were able to see the videotapes of Zubaydah's hard interrogations by the CIA. But where are those? They've been destroyed. And as a matter of fact, we didn't know that. They were destroyed in the end of 2004, the beginning of 2005. It wasn't until 2007 that the director of the CIA informed us that 2 videotapes of the hard interrogations, what most people would consider torture, had been destroyed, and one of them belonged to Zubaydah. Years later, in 2009, we found out, oh, it's not just 2, it's 92 tapes, most of which were Zubaydah's tapes in the very earliest days. So what are they hiding, Leonardo? What is it that I was told by 2 members of American intelligence independently that were in a position to know what transpired in these interrogations, gave me this information independently, corroborating each other in unusual ways, and then a defense intelligence official who talked to me in a broader sense about the interrogations and the methods that were used. We know that Zubaydah, who was at the time that he was captured in 2002, considered a high detainee value suspect for al-Qaeda. He was wounded in the operation to take him inside of Pakistan. And the Americans then applied to him a combination of pain medication to relieve the pain, keeping him alive, and then at other times giving him sodium pentothal, the so-called truth serum, to try to get him to talk. And he wouldn't even give his name. So eventually they put him under what they called this false flag operation, in which he woke up at one point when they had moved him to another location in Afghanistan, and he was meant to believe that he was being interrogated by Saudi interrogators. The reason for that ruse was that the Americans had gambled that that would make him talk. The Saudis wanted him for crimes. He had already been listed there for a series of terror attacks that they thought he'd been responsible for. And he knew the Saudis meant business. They would torture him and they would execute him. If he came back to the Americans, he might be willing to talk more. And what does he do? He doesn't get scared at all when he sees that there are supposedly Saudi interrogators. He says instead, oh, thank goodness it's you, in so many words. Please call this fellow. And he gives them a cell phone number and a private telephone number to Prince Ahmed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz, who is the owner of the largest media empire at that time, 42, 43 years old, the largest media empire in Saudi Arabia, the owner of a racehorse that won the Kentucky Derby, very westernized, urbanized. The American interrogators don't know what to do with that. So they go back to the CIA and they discuss what's next and what they might be able to do. And when they go back to Zubaydah, they say, you know, you're a liar. It's absolutely a scandal. You're a scurrilous, no good fabricator. And he says, no, I'm not. As a matter of fact, if you think that's a problem, call these people as well. And he now gives the private cell phone numbers of 2 other princes, Prince Sultan bin Faisal bin Turki Al Saud, who's a 41-year-old former military officer and a friend of Ahmed, and a contemporary of his, a younger prince in his 20s, this Prince Fuad bin Turki bin Saud Al Kabir. And then he gives them the telephone number of the head of the Pakistani Air Force, an Air Marshal Musharraf Ali Mir. According to Zubaydah, who's now playing his get out of jail free card, he was there when Prince Turki, the head of Saudi intelligence, met with bin Laden in the mid-90s in Afghanistan. He was there supposedly when Musharraf Ali Mir met with bin Laden and Turki from the intelligence chief. The Americans don't know what to do with this information. It's where they're still looking for where the next attack might come from. And they made a great strategic error. This much we know without any doubt. They told the Saudi intelligence officials what Zubaydah had disclosed. And all I can tell you is that the 4 people who were named, I can't tell you there was a murder operation, but I can tell you that if it's a coincidence, it's one of the great coincidences of investigative history. They all end up dying within 7 months of each other. Prince Ahmed bin Saud, who's the first prince, the key one named by Zubaydah, dies of a heart attack or an infection from an operation in Riyadh. And the second prince, his friend, dies a day later in a 1-car accident. The third prince dies, the Saudi royal court says, of thirst, 55 miles outside of Riyadh. And Musharraf Ali Mir and his wife and all of his top staff blow up in an airplane over Pakistan on a case that ended up in a dead end on an investigation. And that's where it stayed for all this time, leaving us as reporters, investigators, with the question of, what's true in Zubaydah's account, what's real, and did it lead to top Saudi officials and the Biden administration before the Trump administration, the Obama administration before that, and then the Bush administration all stonewall it because they don't want to upset the Saudis?
Well, one thing that Abu Zubaydah said is that the Saudis revoked Osama bin Laden's citizenship just apparently just for faking that they were not supporting him, while actually what they were doing was supporting him under the rug, just with the agreement that he wouldn't strike in Saudi Arabia. Could they have lied to the world like that?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, once you read the information and see how it happened, it makes sense that they lie to the world that way, because it's the equivalent of, I think sometimes I grew up in an Italian American neighborhood in San Francisco, and most of the people were hardworking, industrious Italian immigrants. Some of them had small stores and grocery stores and coffee shops. And then occasionally, some of the immigrants who weren't that great, who got involved in gangland activity, would extort money from them for safety. They'd go to those store owners and say, by the way, you're going to get a broken window or somebody's going to rob you. We'll protect you. Pay us $100 a week or whatever it is. And essentially, that's what the Saudis were doing to bin Laden in reverse. They were saying to him, okay, stay out of our neighborhood. Don't come inside the kingdom. You want to play jihad, that's fine, but go elsewhere to do it. And they were providing him enough money to make sure that he had a viable organization. And the agreement that was unsaid, there's no written agreement, there's no contract here, there's nothing that says from bin Laden, I won't strike in Mecca. But that was the unsaid agreement, and that he would do everything outside. There was even an element inside of Saudi intelligence under Prince Turki. He was very, very good head of intelligence for them, very savvy, very, very aware of what the international situation was, that bin Laden and his ragtag group of al-Qaeda could be a counterweight in some regions or countries to the rise of Shia militias. And they were thinking about that. Saudi Arabia had watched sort of aghast in the Iran-Iraq war, which took place in the 80s, in which, we saw the birth of suicide bombers with the Iranians and the Shia militias that existed inside Iraq and other places. So in some ways, a Sunni group like al-Qaeda could be the tough kids on the block when it came to that type of outside militia. The Saudis saw a number of possibilities in bin Laden other than just terrorism.
Well, as you mentioned, according to what Abu Zubaydah said, there was also a Pakistani high officer by the name of Musharraf Ali Mir, who was part of the agreement. And he was also giving supplies and money and protection to Osama bin Laden with the blessing of the Saudis. How does Pakistan enter the equation? Because after 9/11, Pakistan pretended they were like one of the strongest American allies. But of course, they were doing something fishy before 9/11. How does Pakistan enter the equation here?
So Pakistan is just a fantastic story of survival. And they, 9/11 was like a light switch went off for the Pakistani military and the chiefs. They didn't stop at their support of some of the most radical Islamist Sunni elements that they had supported before 9/11, but they put it underground much, much further away. And Musharraf, who was running the country then, understood that the survival of Pakistan meant that they had to be on the side of the Americans in this war publicly. And they were. Look, they allowed a number of operations that could not have been done without the assistance of Pakistani military, the assistance of their intelligence operations. And then they would stand back and say, oh, well, we had nothing to do with that. But they did assist the Americans after 9/11. Before 9/11, let no one forget that Pakistan was one of two countries on the face of the earth, together with the Saudis, who had recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan the first time around. When the Taliban had taken over, there were only two nations that stepped forward. They're Sunni nations. And they said, oh, by the way, you in Afghanistan, the Taliban, we recognize you as the legitimate operators. It'll show you how far the Saudis and Pakistanis were already there. There's a Islamist family in the northwest region, in the tribal region of Pakistan, in the area that borders Afghanistan, the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network, to me, and I have looked into them for a long time, they are really a criminal syndicate. They are involved in everything from cross-border smuggling to arms trade, you name it, they're involved in it. They happen to be Islamists, so that they're fundamentalists, but they're also an organized criminal group. Pakistan has them on their territory, and they've never cracked down on them because they have this uneasy partnership and alliance and relationship with them. So Pakistan has always been sleeping with the enemy, if you want to look at it as the enemy, or the devil, and at the same time wanting its cooperation with the West. And they had to make a choice on 9/11, and they basically chose to keep the contacts with the far radical fundamentalists at the same time that publicly, as you said, they aligned themselves with the U.S.
Well, last year, around July, if I remember well, the memorandum of the 9/11 Commission interview with Prince Turki was published. And they mention you because at a certain point, the two commissioners asked the prince, what do you think about Gerald Posner's reporting about which you guys had foreknowledge of the attacks? And he said that you made the whole story up because the three princes that Abu Zubaydah mentioned had no political role. And then this Pakistani guy was not in such a high position to be in the position of being able to talk to Osama bin Laden. How do you reply to that?
So the interesting thing is, I would expect no less from a sophisticated and very good diplomat like Prince Turki. And he's very careful with his words. You know, I'm a lawyer in another life, but he could be a lawyer in this life because he picks his words carefully. He says, you know, to the best of my understanding, the way that I understand it, it's certainly not this way. Then if somebody could prove otherwise, he would say, well, I was unaware of that. I knew none of that. He points out that the reason that he's sure that I'm wrong is that the individuals named by Zubaydah weren't political. That, Leonardo, is exactly why they were chosen by the Saudis as the middlemen, because they weren't political. The US, the Europeans, when we're looking at terror groups and links and organizations, we're looking at the radicals, we're looking at the imams, we're looking at the people who are on the street raising money to send to charities that are funding fundamentalist fighters fighting in Bosnia and other places. We aren't looking at the owners of a racehorse that win the Kentucky Derby. We aren't looking at the non-political princes inside. There are 4,000 princes, remember, inside the kingdom in Saudi Arabia. And so the ones that can be very effective for you are those who don't necessarily advertise that they are helping the fundamentalists. So that doesn't surprise me at all. The other thing that's critical is this. Those are the numbers. Those are the names given by Zubaydah. So the real question becomes not from Prince Turki saying, I don't believe that those people had that power or they would have been dealing with al-Qaeda. The real reason is, why do Zubaydah have those names and numbers, and what do they mean to him?
Well, Prince Turki himself was also the head of the Saudi intelligence, and he resigned 10 days before 9/11. Is that a coincidence, in your opinion?
You know, I would love to be able to sit here today to say to you and say, no, I think that was part of a grand plot, and it's the absolute smoking gun of the fact that Saudis knew. But no, I think it is a coincidence in this case. I have found no evidence to show me from any source, and I've looked at this 100 ways, to show that the Saudis got rid of him because they knew 9/11 was coming. As a matter of fact, Leonardo, if the Saudis suddenly got the word that a major attack in America was coming, and they learned that Prince Turki had some foreknowledge of it, the last thing they would do would be to get rid of him 10 days before the attack took place. They would stick with him through this entire period, and they would sort of have a denial across the board. So I think that was bad timing that looks terrible, but didn't have anything to do with 9/11 in terms of a conspiracy.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of this interview that the four people mentioned by Abu Zubaydah were killed within months from each other, and they are all now dead. This sounds a little bit far-fetched, like a little bit too much like a spy movie, but I would like to hear your opinion on something and on this matter. And what is striking to me is that, would the Saudis really kill their own princes?
I think that, so the question is, and it's a question that I can't give the answer to. As you know, in the book, I try to walk this fine line between presenting the evidence of their deaths, which are unusual. One of them dies in a hospital at 43. Okay, people do die of problems from surgery afterwards. Fine. The next day, the second prince is on his way to the funeral of the first prince. As you know, in the Muslim faith, like in the Jewish faith, they bury the next day. He's on his way to the funeral of the first prince, and he's in a one-car accident. The Saudi investigators say it was speeding, went off the road, killed himself. All right, that could happen. The third prince dies a week later, the 25-year-old, in a Rolls Royce, 55 miles outside of Riyadh. The official cause of death, he died of thirst. That seems to me to be a little odd, but all right. And then Musharraf Ali Mir gets blown up in his plane once it takes off in clear weather. It is possible that all of those things happened as real things without anybody murdering them, and they look very suspicious. They certainly look suspicious to me. They raise my idea. I can't prove that they were murdered. I can't prove that there was a plot put out or an order to murder them. But it certainly makes me say, as an investigator, as a reporter, it needs to be further looked at. And the only people that can do that at this time is not you, not me, not the Washington Post or New York Times or whoever. It needs to be done at a government level. The government needs to push that together. And that's what the governments have not done. Instead, what they did after the disclosure in 2003 in my book about this is they did two things. We know they destroyed the early tapes with the Zubaydah, but they also started something. They started a whisper campaign. I know this. The CIA, people in the CIA that I had dealt with, talked to other reporters, and they said, you know, Posner, he's wrong. That's just wrong. He believes it. He's been fed that information, but it's just incorrect. They did their best to make sure that that information just didn't go anywhere, and it didn't. And that makes me more suspicious. So I still say, why don't we know what Zubaydah knows? We don't even know after 20 years being held for over 20 years in Guantanamo. We know that he lost an eye at one point, subjected to the torture that he was given. You know, whether he's even able to remember in detail what happened back then. The shame of it is that the videotapes with him were destroyed and that information is buried. I am convinced that there are notes and files about what happened in those interrogations, but we have never seen them published. One last thing. The Inspector General for the CIA, who began to investigate in 2003, 2 years after 9/11, the methods being used by CIA interrogators to determine whether they crossed the line, whether in fact they were using torture with these high-value detainees. He was provided videotapes of the initial interrogations. And guess what? It turns out now we know from the Inspector General's report that they did not give him the early videotapes of the Zubaydah interrogations. So the CIA, have been hiding the early Zubaydah interrogations from day one.
Well, as you just mentioned, they destroyed the tapes. So what I'm wondering now is that the normal procedure? And if not, why did they do it?
No, it's not a normal procedure. They're supposed to keep the tapes. And as a matter of fact, they were supposed to keep the tapes even by law because they knew the Inspector General was looking at it. They destroyed those tapes. Put aside for a second the issue that I'm raising here about what he said, who he pinpointed in terms of Saudi princes and this Pakistani military official. The reason that I think the early tapes were destroyed on Zubaydah, remember that President Bush only mentioned the name of a single detainee, single prisoner who had been captured. That was Zubaydah. Talked about him in a press conference. Bush wasn't a great one with names, as you know, but he remembered Zubaydah to say that he was a high-value detainee. They used everything on Zubaydah. And what I mean by that is not just waterboarding, but I believe that they used mock, they did this in other cases as well, not just the fake flag operation, but they used mock executions. They had threats that they would kill members of the family. They threatened to rape female members of his family. And so there's a level of crossing the line in those early interrogations that they did not want to see the light of day.
Well, as you just said, this guy was tortured, beaten, drugged, threatened. and now he's out of his mind and he cannot speak anymore. So apart from the human side of what you said, that is totally unacceptable, even if you do it on a terrorist, the CIA pretty much destroyed their source with their own hands. How could they do something that dumb?
Yeah, it's unbelievable that you say that, but that's what ended up happening. The CIA did destroy their own source on this. However, the question that I'm not sure of to this day as we speak is whether there were elements inside Central Intelligence who wanted to do that, who thought, you know what, it's better off if we have a drooling idiot who has been, given electric shock and waterboarded too many times than somebody capable of repeating a story that's going to be harmful. And the evidence of this, another piece of evidence, it's not evidence in a direct way, but it's what I call corroborating evidence in a secondary manner. In 2009, you might remember, and some of your listeners might remember, Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General then of the United States, the Obama administration had just taken office in 2008. He announced with great fanfare, it was worldwide news at a press conference, that the United States was going to transfer 4 or 5 of the highest value prisoners from Guantanamo, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, including Abu Zubaydah, to New York to stand trial. That was major news because the Obama administration believed you could not hold them forever in Guantanamo Bay without charges and putting them on trial, and not in this military trial. They should be tried in the Justice Department. And you know what? That never took place. Clearly, somebody said to Eric Holder and to the Obama people very shortly afterwards, they had a talk with them from CIA and other places. You've got to be kidding. Do you know what would be happening? You would be putting the CIA and the interrogators on trial. You wouldn't be putting al-Qaeda on trial. So that never happened. But at the time that Holder said that, Zubaydah was on that list that was going to be transferred to New York for trial. Boy, that never happened.
Well, let's come to the most important and most difficult question of them all. Why did the Saudis do something like that? I think that we have a few options. For instance, we can imagine that probably al-Qaeda infiltrated somehow the government or the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, or maybe the government in Riyadh had to do something to keep the terrorists at bay, to prevent revolts against them, against the kingdom, and attacks inside Saudi Arabia itself. What do you think? Why did the Saudis shield them? Or even not only shield them, why did the Saudis actually help the terrorists?
Well, I think because they were afraid of the terrorists, in part the royal family. And that's been since, that was really from the time that you had the Kuwait was captured by the Iraqis. And then, the coalition, the American-led coalition goes in with Europeans to liberate Kuwait. And Saudi Arabia is afraid at that time that Saddam Hussein is going to send his troops south and into the kingdom. Osama bin Laden offered the king the possibility of bringing his own forces, his al-Qaeda forces, into the kingdom to protect the kingdom against the Saddam Hussein's forces. He said essentially to the royal court in Riyadh, no Muslim army will attack us. No Muslim army will attack us. We are the Mujahideen. We're the fighters. We've beaten the Soviets in Afghanistan. Let us stand with you. And instead, the Saudis are realists. They said, well, you're pretty good, but we'd rather have the biggest kid on the block, the Americans. So they had the Americans go into the kingdom. That was very controversial, and set up bases to protect the kingdom from an invasion against Iraq. Saddam Hussein, never went into Saudi Arabia, but bin Laden was furious with that. He viewed that as treachery, that you would invite the infidel into the holiest of all lands, the land that has Mecca, the holy sites for Islam, for Sunni Islam. So that was the point at which bin Laden becomes an enemy of the royals. And he wanted, in his own way, bin Laden, to overthrow the royals as much as he wanted to see the destruction of the Western imperialist societies as he saw it. And I think the Saudis knew that. To the extent that the Saudis, a few of them, who were in contact or passing money to bin Laden, might have had advanced knowledge. According to Zubaydah, he said that 2 of them did. We don't know if that's true, though. He said that the main prince, Prince Ahmed bin Salman, who's the son of the king, current king, he knew about 9/11 beforehand and that the Pakistani Air Force did. I don't know. I don't believe they knew 9/11 as we've come to understand it after it happened. What I mean by that is they might have known that al-Qaeda planned an attack on that day, around that day, against American interest. They might not know where the interests were going to be, might not have known if it was going to be in the United States. But I believe that if the Saudi royal court at the very top had known about the details of 9/11 attack against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, they would have stopped it or leaked word to the Americans because they realized that that would wake up the tiger, which it did in many ways in that aftermath.
Well, and the other side of the coin to the last question that I asked is, why is the US so reluctant actually to investigate the Saudi role? Because the Bush administration didn't do anything specific. The Obama administration didn't do anything big either. Trump didn't do anything big either. And the only one who's actually doing something is President Biden, who signed an order a couple of years ago, to disclose some documents about the investigation by the FBI. It's not a big game changer, but a lot of details have come to the surface. So what do you think the US don't want to embarrass the Saudis up to this point?
Because it's a little bit like, at the end of that great movie Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart, the French policeman says to one of his, police men, go ahead and round up the usual suspects. We'll wrap up the crime. In this case, they found out who carried it out, the 19 hijackers, 16 of whom were Saudi. And as far as the U.S. is concerned in the government role, that's case closed. They've gotten their people. They don't want to look any further. They don't want to look to the next stage because right now, as you know, from the time really of 9/11 and on, the U.S. has needed Saudi Arabia, not just for energy. It's not the old story that they need them for oil, as has been the case for so many decades. But they need them as a counterweight in the Middle East to the Iranians. They need them. They're trying to induce them to become part of the Abraham Accords. They've been wooing them on so many different geopolitical levels. If if MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, hadn't been included and so inculpated in the murder of the journalist Khashoggi in Turkey, they would have had a much more robust diplomatic relationship with the Saudis for a longer time. So I think that what they've said is internally, and I can't prove this to you by giving you the exact document, but my feeling from talking to people is they've said, whatever happened, that's water under the bridge. We found the people who did it. We're not going to worry about it any further. We've got more important strategic matters waiting for us, including having a counterweight to Iran. And that's helped the Saudis get past this.
That's probably what happened. Well, Gerald, many thanks again for your time. I just would like to recommend again to my viewers to read this book, which explains all that we've discussed today and much, much more about all the other intelligence failures that prevented the stoppage of 9/11. So thanks again for your time and for your very precious explanations that you gave me and my viewers today.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. And I will just leave you with this, and you know this from the book. Although we talked a lot about the Saudis and that, I think the book makes fairly clear that the 9/11 could have been stopped. The CIA had information before 9/11. They had followed two people into the U.S. who moved to California after being at two Saudis who went to a terror summit meeting in Malaysia. The CIA followed them into California when they moved there, and then the CIA lost track of them. Those two people, Al-Madar and Al-Zarni, took out licenses, driver's license in California in their own names. They bought a car. They made reservations for their 9/11 flights in their own names. The CIA told no one about them. If they had shared that information earlier with the FBI or with the Federal Aviation Commission, it would have been possible to stop the entire attack. So there's a lot of blame to go around here. Not all of it is just at those who may have pulled the attack off, but the incompetence at times of our own American intelligence agencies that failed to prevent an attack, something they do not like to talk about.
Oh, that's definitely correct. For instance, we didn't mention Omar al-Bayoumi in this interview, but that would have been another very long discussion because
Right.
a Saudi agent supported two of the hijackers in California and helped with them
Yeah.
finding a house, paying their rent, and things of the
And
sort.
and just by coincidence happened to be at a little diner one day near the airport and realized, oh my goodness, that person a couple of tables away, they sound like they're Saudi, and then introduced themselves. Intelligence agent undercover at the Saudi mission meets two future hijackers just by coincidence. No, I have trouble believing that, but that's for another day. We can talk about it.
And it was sitting facing the exit, well, actually the entrance. So it could see them coming in. Yeah,
That's
that's
right.
totally not a coincidence. I don't believe that either. Thanks again for your time, Gerald. Thanks for the explanations you gave us today.
Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you.
Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.